All right, this is joint work with Bian from UBC, Qiushi Huang from SAFE, and Ye from UW. I'm Tang from Wharton. Let me start with the big picture motivation. We live in what's often called a digital surveillance economy. With smartphones in every pocket and tracking technologies embedded in websites and apps, companies nowadays can collect and exchange data on users in real time at massive scale. Perhaps none of this sounds really surprising to you, but this shift is definitely clear from the rise of major data aggregators like Axiom and the more famous Oracle, each of which has been quietly building profiles on billions of people, pulling in data from all kinds of sources, from what we browse and buy to where we go and who we interact with. So if you take a look at this graph, I don't know how much you can read from the infographics. I certainly did not expect major data aggregators to infer things like a simulation score or the probability of someone planning to have a child versus adopting a child. So motivated by the unprecedented scope of the data economy, in this paper, we take a small step towards measuring and characterizing data as a form of intangible capital that firms increasingly rely on to grow their user base and inform product offerings. Let me give you a quick summary of what we do in the paper. First, we identify a network of inter-firm data conduit based on firms' usage of third-party data analytics tools. This is derived from the source code of all mobile apps owned by publicly listed firms. So overlaps in the connections to these third-party data analytics platforms signal potential data sharing, which underlines our data connectedness measure. Our firm sample includes slightly over 1,000 US public firms, which represent over 60% of the asset in the compute stack universe, making it a relevant sample. Our resulting data connectedness measure features very little overlap with other type of firm linkages documented in prior work, such as product space overlap, supply chain relationships, or technological proximity based on pattern data. Next, we show that the between-firm data sharing leads to a co-movement in performance, such as user growth, cash flows, as well as stock performance. To establish causality in the reduced form evidence, we take advantage of a shock that substantially restricts the data sharing, and I will be more clear about what that shock is. Importantly, this data sharing-driven performance co-movement is not explained by these other linkages documented in the literature or common exposure to standard risk factors. In addition, we also show that a key origin of this performance co-movement is the propagation of idiosyncratic shocks. Using cyber incidents as our empirical setting, we view it as idiosyncratic shocks to firms' data stock. Finally, in the second part of the paper, we build and calibrate a dynamic model of firms' investment decisions facing this network. Our model characterizes three distinct features of data. First, data is a byproduct of firms' business operation. For example, Amazon, by running the e-commerce platform, can organically accumulate data points about your shopping behavior and product preferences. Second, data is non-rival, meaning multiple firms can access the same dataset without diminishing its availability to yet another firm in the network. And lastly, it exhibits cross-firm externalities, as one firm's data may be useful or informative about another firm's customers. We then calibrate the model to match the observed empirical findings on the performance co-movement. A key insight from our model is a valuation tool, which we label as a network-augmented Gordon growth formula that takes into account this data spillover effect. The model also implies a network version marginal Q of data. What that means is, we're going to observe some type of herding behavior in firms' investment decisions / product design choices. The mechanism is strategic complementarity. As one firm's data lowers the cost of targeting users and acquiring new users for another firm, it's going to prompt this other firm to invest in data accumulation and user acquisition as well. And this mechanism will become clearer over time. All right? So the next two slides contain just the essential technical details to understand our data connectedness measure. Data in silos really has limited power. In order to build comprehensive customer profiles, data analytics platforms must merge different data points about the same individual collected by different companies. How does this work in practice? In the mobile environment, this is facilitated by the so-called software development kits, or SDKs, which are pre-built software components that can be easily integrated into mobile apps. So think of SDKs as Python libraries. They basically offer a ready-made solution so that developers don't have to write everything from scratch. And data SDKs is a particular category of SDKs that allow companies to track users across different apps or share data across different apps. A key detail in this data sharing process is the existence of a unique universal identifier managed and issued by Apple. The name of this identifier is called IDFA, or Identifier for Advertisers. An example is highlighted in orange. It's basically a combination of letters and numbers. But because this ID is issued and managed by Apple as a platform, it applies universally to all companies collecting data from iOS mobile users, which makes mobile data much more connected than data collected from other sources, such as website. If you have heard of the word website cookies, something else you need to know about cookies is they are often fragmented and website specific, making it much more difficult to connect data in the web space relative to the mobile environment. So to recap, the takeaway from these technical details is firms are connected in the data space through the SDKs owned by data analytics platforms. Let me be fully transparent here. We don't observe the actual data flow between firm pairs. If we think of firms as isolated islands, what we observe is the bridges connecting these islands, but not necessarily the traffic going through the bridges. All right? So to establish causality in our reduced form analysis, we take advantage of Apple's app tracking transparency policy. What happened is in April of 21, Apple banned the IDFA-based user tracking and data sharing by default. To continue accessing that unique ID for data sharing purposes, all companies must obtain explicit user approval through this pop-up notification. So I assume there are a lot of iPhone users in this room. Some of you may have seen this pop-up notification, which basically says, oh, this app would like permissions to track you across apps and websites owned by other companies. Would you allow it or not? So what was your reaction? I also assume most of you probably said no to this request. If a user declines the data sharing request, the IDFA, your IDFA, remain inaccessible to firms and these SDK providers, effectively cutting off cross-app data sharing. If you have never seen such request, don't panic as well. It just means you have a blanket privacy policy in place that forbids data sharing by default. So what was the impact? According to industry report, over 90% of the users opted out either by default or by choice, making ATT a substantial negative shock to the data sharing network. Based on the idea that data SDKs facilitate data sharing, we're going to build this firm pairwise measure of data connectedness as follows. For every single firm pair, we're going to compute the cosine similarity between two vectors, with each element record the company's usage of one of the top 50 data SDKs. So each element is a binary variable, usage or no usage, multiplied by the share of the company's monthly active users exposed to each of these SDKs. A higher data connectedness means these two companies are sharing data on a larger set of users through more common SDKs. Let me make two notes on the resulting data connectedness measure. First, it's very different from the traditional firm linkages we have seen in the literature, such as product space overlap, customer supply chain relationship, technological proximity based on patent. Second, it's fairly stable over time. In terms of the temporal variation, it is comparable to that of the Holberg-Philip text-based network industry classification measure along both the vertical and horizontal dimension. So motivated by this second observation, we're going to treat the network as given, as static, and use the pre-ATT average value throughout our empirical analysis. Now, let me use Amazon as an example to further illustrate our measure. So on this graph on the right-hand side, you see a list of companies. Those are Amazon's top connected data peers based on our measure. Take a look at the household names, and I hope you can read well. They basically cover a wide range of industries. We have Capital One, which is a finance firm, followed by Restaurant Brand International, which is a fast food holding company, Charter Communication, Telecom, Uber Technology, a platform, so on and so forth, and even General Motors, which is a car manufacturer. And in the middle, you see the SDKs installed by either Amazon or one of these top connected firms. So let me use Amazon, General Motors, and Uber to illustrate how firms that look very different at first glance may benefit from data sharing. All right? So General Motors collect tons of data from their vehicle sales, financing, and connected car system. By passing over that data to Amazon through the SDKs in the middle, it allows Amazon to reach the right customers. Say, somebody who just purchased an EV may start seeing ads on home chargers or car accessories. On the other hand, Amazon has a lot of e-commerce insight on which demographics are into EV accessories or trending gears, and this will allow General Motors to optimize their marketing campaign geographically. On the other hand, if we look at Amazon and Uber, Uber has a lot of data on where people are going, when they're traveling, how they're paying and tipping, and that data allows Amazon to also target more effectively. Say somebody like me who is always catching ride to the airport may start seeing ads on luggages or travel accessories or even Kindle book for the road. And on the other hand, Amazon observes a lot of data on, who subscribed to their premium services or who is ordering from Whole Foods. And that will give Uber pretty good clue about maybe in this region, the delivery order demand is going to surge, or this neighborhood is going to be less responsive to promotions within Uber Eats. All right, so the takeaway here is the data peers really go beyond traditional industry boundary. We then generalize this case study to include many more firm pairs in our sample. In this heat map, the diagonal cells are firm pairs from within the same industry, and the off-diagonal terms are firms from different industries. So red color means strong data connection, blue color, weaker data connection. The pattern is quite clear. The within-industry data sharing is neither stronger nor weaker than cross-industry data sharing. Otherwise, we see much stronger color patterns, either deep blue or deep red, along the diagonal. One exception is actually telecom. That's the red cross you are seeing on the heat map. Telecom firms tend to share data with firms from nearly every single other industry, likely because they control the infrastructure through which all online traffic flow, which gives them a natural position to share data with a lot of other firms. So if we map out the entire data sharing network, we get this graph. Here, every single bubble represents a firm with the size of the bubble representing the size of its customer base. Different colors are different clusters or communities as determined by a network algorithm. So let's take a look at who sits at the center of the network. First of all, we have the usual suspect, Meta and Google, which are these two gigantic dots, and I don't need to really explain further why they're at the center of the network. But there are also some less obvious players, for example, MCD, which is the ticker of the company. So which company is it? It's McDonald's. It turns out McDonald's sits at the center of the network because they heavily rely on third-party data analytics tools to acquire users and to optimize the within-app menu offering and promotions. We also have a bunch of firms on the periphery, which tend to be large retail firms like Nike, Target, Walmart, and Mattel. They do use data, but they're not as deeply embedded in the data sharing network. So far, I have only provided descriptives about our data sharing measure. Next, move to the first main reduced form evidence, which show that data sharing matters for performance. Here in this regression table, each observation is a firm pair, and the outcome variable is the time series correlation in various performance metrics. On this table, we focus on user activities as captured by downloads or daily active users, DAU. First line coefficient positive, which means a higher data connectedness is associated with stronger performance co-movement. But ATT changes everything. The interaction term in the second row is negative and cancels out the baseline coefficient. Importantly, when we control for a wide range of alternative firm linkages documented in prior work in the even columns, our main point estimate remains largely unchanged, indicating that the data connectedness measure is capturing a distinct type of economic linkages. Among all these alternative firm linkages, such as product space overlap, supply chain relationships, technological proximity, common analyst coverage, so on and so forth, the Holberg-Philip product space overlap along the horizontal dimension turns out to have the strongest explanatory power when it comes to predicting performance co-movement across the board. So that is why we're using it as a benchmark to kind of interpret the magnitude of our result. So in terms of predicting co-movement in user activity, our measure has a clear edge with the effect 2 to 3 times larger than theirs. However, as you will see on the next slides, when we move to co-movement in cash flows or stock returns, their measure becomes stronger, likely because many firms has non-data-driven business segment that's not covered by our measure. All right? Moving to the next table, the only thing that changed is the performance metrics. Here we are looking at co-movement in earnings growth or asset turnover ratio, which is simply sales over asset. The results are qualitatively similar, but as mentioned before, our magnitude weakens a little bit due to this non-data-driven cash flow of our firms. We also find qualitatively similar results when we look at performance co-movement in terms of stock returns adjusted for market risk or the DGTW benchmark that sorts firms based on their size, past returns, and market-to-book ratio. So far, we have provided evidence that data sharing matters for firm performance, but you may wonder, what is the origin of the performance co-movement? We argue a key source of such co-movement is the propagation of idiosyncratic shocks to firms. And we use cyber attacks as a form of negative idiosyncratic shocks to a firm's data stock. Think of it as a sudden loss in data access or your customer base because the customer doesn't trust your services anymore. What we show is when one firm gets hit by a major cyber incident, its connected data peers experience a sudden decline in their user activity as well as stock market performance. So this provides direct evidence that the data sharing network is not just associated with performance, it is an actual channel of shock transmission. So that's the reduced form evidence which actually motivate our structure model. In the remaining time, let me talk about this dynamic model of firms in the data economy. The purpose of the model is multifold. First, we're going to use the model to rationalize some of the observed performance co-movement patterns. Then, the model provides a piece of useful valuation tools, a valuation formula, which also allow us to identify the most important firms in the network, which we call the systemically important firms. Right? So I will give you a high-level summary of the key ingredients and economic forces in the model using this animation. Starting from the blue block, this block illustrates how firms use and accumulate data. Every single period, firm I combines its first-party data, delta I, with data from connected peers, delta J, to form a composite data set, capital D. The higher the connection, the more weight these other firms' data carry in that composite data set. And this entire weight is an n by n matrix, which is denoted by gamma, so that's the network adjacency matrix. So what do firms use the data for? They use the data to learn about customer preferences and product demand. So more data means sharper forecast, which allows the firms to drive more user engagement, YI. But here's the interesting part for the data economy. More user engagement also generate more data for next period. So this leads to a self-perpetuating loop of the data growth, which is a concept proposed in Fabudi and Velkamp 21 paper. So this directly comes from the nature that data is a byproduct of firms' business operation. The more people shop on Amazon, the more data points they get to accumulate about their customers. This blue block represents the baseline level of profit and customer base firms can generate without actively investing. Firms can obviously also expand its customer base by making investment decisions. In our model, the investment decision can be thought of as the product design choices. So what type of product design choices do firms have? Two types of choices. They can either prioritize user engagement. Think about a lot of apps offering free features. Why? Because they want to accumulate data. This is going to hurt their current profit, but it will help grow the long-term data stock. Or they can choose to monetize right away by moving the features behind the paywall, which raise current profit at the expense of long-term data growth. Importantly, data from the network help alleviate this intertemporal trade-off. So how does it work? Let me use an airline company as an example. If you're an airline company, and you know exactly where to find the people who are willing to buy business class tickets that are super expensive thanks to the data from the network, then you can also afford offering more aggressive promotions on the economy fare and partner hotels while still generating strong profit from that small yet high value segment. So this is how the data externalities play out in the model. Firms derive revenue or profit from two sources. The first source is the revenue from these newly acquired users corresponding to the bottom orange block. The second source is profit from existing users. That's the traditional customer capital channel corresponding to the blue block. Firms' valuation is nothing but the present value of these future cash flows coming from the two channels. And our valuation formula, as you will see on the next slide, is going to incorporate the data spillover at higher orders and across multiple horizons. All right, so let me recap here and use this animation to talk about how our model characterizes the three distinct features of data. First of all, data is a byproduct of firm's business operation that shows up in the step of going from customer activity, your shopping behavior, to next period data points about you. Second, data is non-rival that shows up in the first step. Multiple firms can draw insights from the same data set without diminishing its availability. Lastly, data exhibit cross-firm externalities, which shows up in this bottom arrow. The data from the network will help the airline companies to target well. After we solve the model under some functional form assumptions, we get this so-called network augmented Gordon growth formula. There are a lot of letters in this full-fledged formula, so let me talk about the intuition behind the formula under a special case, which is, what if we disallow data sharing? Absent of data sharing, the network adjacency matrix collapses into identity matrix where you only have the diagonal terms because firms only care about their own first-party data. In this case, we actually recover the standard Gordon growth formula where the numerator is the cash flow that only depends on the firm's first-party data stock, and the denominator is the discount rate negative the growth rate. Once you allow for data sharing, this matrix is no longer the identity matrix, and we have the more general formulation where you can see valuation depends on not only your first-party data delta I, but every single other firm's data delta J conditional on them connecting to you. So that's why the valuation becomes interlinked, and that directly generates this performance co-movement we observed in the data. On the next slide, I want to interpret the key parameter in the Gordon growth formula, which is the growth rate beta. Where does the growth rate of the data economy come from? Remember, there are two sources of profit for firms in our model. The first source is profit from existing users. The second source is profit from these newly acquired users through changes in product design. So our growth rate parameter beta actually captures exactly these two sources. It has two components. The first component is this blue alpha parameter, which corresponds to the blue block or existing users. It reflects the productivity of existing data stock. How effective can firm use its data stock to stimulate customer activity? More customer activity translate into more first-party data next period, which feeds into the broader data network. The second source of profit is newly acquired users, and that's captured by the second parameter, phi0 over phi1, which reflect the trade-off between monetization and user engagement. A higher ratio is going to incentivize firms to prioritize user engagement, for example, by offering a lot of free features that boost customer activity, which again translate into more first-party data next period and feeds into the broader data network. So you can see common to both channels, we have this crucial step of having customer activity translating into first-party data. And the theta parameter actually denotes the conversion rate between customer activity and data, which we interpret as the data collection efficiency. And finally, there is this last step of getting the data into the network where we apply a multiplier Qiushi. Qiushi can be interpreted as the fraction of linkable data, the fraction of data that has a unique ID attached to each line of observation. And here is exactly where ATT plays out. ATT weakens the overall growth rate, which happens to be also the strength of the shock propagation, by reducing the fraction of linkable Qiushi that is multiplied by these other parameters we talked about. All right, so with this valuation formula in hand, we can actually go ahead to calibrate the model. We calibrate the key parameters, the growth rate and the size of the ATT shock, which is a change in that Qiushi parameter, to match our two regression coefficients from the performance co-movement analysis. Based on our calibration, the size of the ATT shock is 0.7, which means post-ATT, the fraction of linkable data dropped by 70%. The overall growth rate of the data economy is 9% per quarter, so 36% per annum. Next, we use the valuation formula for one application, which is to understand which firms matter the most in the network, and we call these firms systemically important firms. How do we define their systemic importance? We're going to compute a ratio of firms' contribution to aggregate cash flow scaled by its own valuation and call this ratio their contribution ratio. Here, we're showing the top 50 firms based on a simple size measure, the size of their daily active users, ranked from the left to the right. So the two largest firms are Meta and Google. Let's take a look at the height of the bar, which is their contribution ratio. Before ATT, Meta has a contribution ratio of 4.2 and Google 9.3, not only because they are large firms, but also because they are the central nodes in the network, as you see in the previous graph. Post-ATT, this contribution ratio drops to 1.2 for Meta and 1.5 for Google. And this is understandable because once data sharing is disrupted, they exert or generate fewer externalities on other firms in the network. In my remaining 2 minutes, let me talk about firms' endogenous investment/product design choices, because we want to know, in the presence of a data sharing network, how firms change their investment behaviors. So here, the classic Q theory logic applies with additional twist. So I'm going to get to that twist very quickly. At the core of firms' investment decisions is a very familiar intertemporal trade-off. Firms can prioritize either user engagement, which reduces today's cash flow but increases future data stock, or they can prioritize monetization, which boosts today's cash flow at the expense of long-term data growth. The Q theory logic dictates that when the marginal value of data exceeds the marginal cost of data, firms are going to prioritize user engagement-friendly features. But what if data becomes networked? In this case, we are going to observe herding behavior in firms' data investment/product design choices. The intuition is very straightforward. It works as follows. If my peer firm ramp up their data investment by offering more and more free features, that's going to grow the entire data network, which means sharper customer insight, and that reduces my cost to target potential new users. When the marginal cost of data accumulation becomes lower, I'm going to invest more as well. So at both the start and the end of this long chain of events of firm investment, empirically, that's going to show up as herding behavior. And this is a direct consequence of the externalities we talked about. It also distinguishes data from other forms of physical asset, because here, one firm's data investments crowd in those by other firms. But typically, in physical capital asset, we see crowd out. As one firm keeps investing and investing, that's going to push up the price of that physical asset, which crowd out other firms' investment. And ATT naturally dampens the herding effect by disrupting the data sharing network. So we take this prediction to the data. It turns out we can also measure firms' product design choices using the same SDK data, but other type of SDKs. For example, to proxy for the monetization intensity, we look at the installation of payment SDKs, which facilitate in-app purchase. Oops. That's okay, that's the last slide. So I can just go without the table, and you have to trust me unconditionally, all right? So let's look at the first column. What the first column shows is when my data peers install a lot of payment SDKs, I tend to do the same, and ATT weakens this herding effect. The same pattern holds qualitatively when we look at features that are more user engagement friendly, such as the installation of data security SDKs, customer support, and review SDKs. Now let me wrap up in the last minute. The contribution of the paper is twofold. On the empirical side, we show how to measure data sharing using SDK data, and that the data sharing network features performance co-movement and the propagation of idiosyncratic shocks. On the theoretical side, we provide a simple and tractable framework that basically spits out a network augmented Gordon-Gorz formula to value data-generated cash flows while taking into account all the spillover effect. And finally, it allows us to identify the systemically important firms in the data sharing network. So the bottom line of the paper is also the headline of the paper. Data is a network asset, and we need to take that into account when thinking about the valuation of firms embedded in the data sharing network. And I look forward to the discussion.